Hello everyone, and welcome to our final seminar of 2023. We've had a great year. I'm hoping everyone can hear me because I know we had a bit of issues with the microphone in the last one, so if we are having any technical difficulties, feel free to mention in the chat. But today we have a great seminar to wrap up our 2023 year. We have Dr. Tanya Latty and Caitlyin Forster. Tanya received her PhD in insect psychology from the insect ecology from the University of Calgary, Canada in 2008. And this was followed by a postdoctoral research position on collective behavior and behavioral ecology at the University of Sydney in Australia. She's now an associate professor at the University of Sydney in the School of Environmental Sciences and is the head of the Invertebrate Behavior and Ecology Lab. And during her career, she worked with a variety of invertebrates, including dragonflies, ants, bees, and slime molds. Dr. Caitlyin Forster received her PhD in 2022 from Dr. Tanya's lab, where she studied bee foraging behaviors. She is currently an associate lecturer of entomology at the University of Sydney. And outside of teaching, she also has a passion for science communication and helping make science more accessible by showcasing backyard science ecology experiments. And so together they will be giving a talk entitled Bees and Blobs, exploring the decoy effect in bee colonies and giant amoebas. So I will pass it over, and thank you again for joining us.
So thank you everybody for inviting me and being here for this talk. My socials are just in the corner there if you ever want to get a hold of me. I also have a fairly unusual name, so if you forget everything, if you can remember Tanya Latty and Google that, there's only one other Tanya Latty that ever comes up, so easy to find. Sorry. Let's see here. Ooh, there we go. Sorry about that. So before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live, work, and where some of the research I'm going to talk about was conducted. It's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty toward this land was never ceded. As behavioral ecologists, I think one of our fundamental questions we try to answer is how and why do animals make the decisions that they do? Because life is full of tough choices. Everything from choosing the right right place to build your nest, choosing which food out of many foods you want to eat and in what order you want to consume them, and deciding who to mate with. These decisions are important because they can influence an animal's fitness down the track. And as a consequence, we expect that natural selection should have shaped organisms to have mechanisms that allow them to make good decisions, subjects to cognitive and informational constraints. Indeed, this idea lies at the core of optimal foraging theory, which is a wildly successful theory that we've been using as behavioral ecologists for decades now to try to predict and understand why animals make the choices that they do. And the core idea here is that we expect that all else being equal, and again, subject to cognitive constraints and informational constraints, that animals should choose the option that best increases their fitness. So let's say you're this little forager and you have a choice between one patch that has a little bit of food and a patch that has a little bit more food. We kind of expect that any forager worth its salt will be able to choose the patch, or will choose the patch that has the highest caloric value or the best yield. This is a relatively simple decision in this case because all my little forager has to care about is how many pellets are in each patch. And it can do that reasonably well. And in fact, we have heaps and heaps of data for lots of systems to show that animals are pretty good at making these kinds of choices. Where things get complicated is when there's more than one thing that a forager or a decision maker cares about. So let's say our little forager again has to choose between these two patches, except in this case, the patch that has the highest reward is also home to a predator, like say the predator. Now our forager has to make decisions taking into account not just how good the food is and how much there is, but also the risk of being predated by the predator. And so these types of decisions are called multi-attribute decisions because there's more than one thing that a forager needs to take into consideration. And this makes decision-making just that much harder. Often the attributes we care about are not even in the same currency. So you can't just trade off calories against calories. You have to have some way of quantifying risk, which is kind of abstract, as well as calories. And in fact, even this situation, which only has two attributes, pales in comparison to decision-making for most organisms. in the real world. Even something as simple, as a pea pod, if we think about the attributes a forager might care about, there are many. Some of these are intrinsic to the food item, like, the carbohydrate content, how much protein does it have? How easy is it to get into that pod? Are there any toxins that might affect the forager? These are things that are characteristic of the particular food, but then that food itself is embedded into a landscape or a patch. And so other factors like how abundant that food is on the landscape, how easy is it to find relative to other foods? Is there a predation risk associated with patches that also have this food? How close is it to home? All of this kind of myriad of factors can be important and can influence an organism's decision-making. And so the question is, if you are a decision maker, how do you deal with all of this complexity? Now, I'm going to talk about foraging behavior for this talk, but I did want to point out that multi-attribute decision-making is not limited by any means to foragers. You'd see the same thing if you're looking for a nest hollow, for example. There's lots of features of that nest hollow that can change the way a decision maker makes their choices. And it's the same with mate choice. It's not maybe just the color, but it could be color and the way that little spider dances. How many other mates are there on the landscape? How many competitors are there for that male's attention? All of these things might factor into an individual's choice of mate. And luckily for us as behavioral ecologists, the psychology folks, particularly behavioral psychologists, have been really interested in understanding multi-attribute decision-making, primarily because they want to learn how to sell us things. And most of the decisions we make as consumers are multi-attribute fundamentally. And so economists and behavioral psychologists have come up with a concept called economic rationality, which is a model of decision-making that should maximize an individual's overall utility. And utility in this context is essentially the same as fitness. It's the value that you get from a particular choice. And what they've worked out is that if you want to always maximize your utility, again, or your fitness, then what you should do is what's called an absolute valuation strategy. You should apply that strategy to all of your decision making. And again, this idea is basically the same thing as optimal foraging theory. Those two ideas share a lot of these fundamental underlying principles. So to illustrate this, I'm going to use an example here. For those of you who have been trying to guess my accent, I'm Canadian originally. And in Canada, we have a wondrous food, possibly the greatest culinary gift Canada has ever given the world, and it is called poutine. It involves thick-cut chips smothered in gravy with nice melty cheese curds, and sometimes we put bacon on it because why not? In my professional opinion, this food is objectively awesome, delicious. However, eating poutine regularly will kill you dead. It is by no means a healthy food item. And so often if you go into a restaurant and you're choosing between poutine, there's usually some other choice, to kind of appease those of us who would like to live to see the age of 50. So for example, a beautiful poke bowl. While I love a poke bowl as much as the next person, it is, again, objectively considerably less awesome than poutine. Now, according to rational decision-making or economists, if I needed to make the decision between these two items, what I'm going to do is figure out which criteria I care about, and then I'm going to assign a value to those criteria, and then I'll simply choose the item that has the highest overall score. So in this example, I care about health, so I've got this health score for those two food items. I also care about just awesomeness because I love food, so I have an attribute. I apply a number to that attribute. Then I do some mental mathematics and come up with a score for each of those. And I choose the item that has the highest score, the best utility. In this case, the poutine wins, yay! And this is what I eat. Now, I should note that even economists don't think that you're actually going to pull out a pen and paper and write all of this down and then, whip out the calculator and make these decisions. But much like behavioral ecologists, economists assume that since this maximizes utility, our cognitive processes will have evolved to be able to kind of run this program in the background. So we may not be consciously aware that we're doing this, but this is what's kind of happening under the hood in our heads. One of the consequences of absolute decision-making is that valuation you apply to that item is static. it doesn't change no matter how many other things you put into the choice set. And this is formalized in something called Luce's choice axiom. And so again, if we've got the poutine and the poke bowl, doesn't matter how many other food items I throw into my choice set, the value of poutine and the value of a poke bowl is a static quantity. I am not comparing across items. I've simply done my calculation for that particular food item. So this leads to something called independence of irrelevant options. And this just means that given that my choices have a static, never changing value, then it doesn't matter how many lower quality, lower scoring items I throw into my choice set, I will always simply choose the poutine over the poke bowl because the poutine has the highest value. So again, just to illustrate this, imagine go into that restaurant. I've got a choice between these two, a salad and a poutine. If there's a very sad and quite frankly disturbing salad in the choice set, the presence of that salad shouldn't change my decision to enjoy the poutine. Because again, the poutine still wins out. It has the highest score. However, economists have long known that humans violate the ideas of economic rationality willy-nilly all over the place. And in fact, when you include a lower quality, irrelevant item like the sad salad, what often happens is a decision maker looks at that salad and goes, oh, I don't want the salad. But if I'm going to have something healthy, I might as well eat something delicious like the poke bowl. And so it makes the poke bowl look a little bit better. Now I'm more likely to choose the poke bowl over the poutine. So the presence of this terrible salad that I never wanted, nobody wants it, it's no good. It's changed the preference relationships between other items in the choice set. And what this indicates is that decision makers, humans in particular, are using comparative strategies. We are not assigning value to items based on a static calculation, and instead we're assigning value by comparing across the choice set. And as a consequence, items that we don't want can have unexpected effects on the choices we make. And so this is called comparative valuation, and it's kind of not exactly equivalent, but I often think of it as being similar to something called the Eigen-Gauss illusion, which you can see on the screen here, where those two orange circles, they're the same size, but the size we perceive them as changes because of the context they're presented in. Those circles can make that circle look a lot bigger than it actually is. And comparative decision-making seems to be something that humans do all the time. So we'll call that type of low-quality decoy our classic decoy, just for the purposes of this section of the talk. We're calling it that because I also want to introduce a second type of decoy called a phantom decoy. So in the previous example, that salad, that low-quality item that we don't want, that's the decoy. In phantom decoys, the irrelevant item is a high-quality thing that we do want, but that is unavailable at the time of choice. So again, let's say we're choosing between the poke bowl and the poutine. And in this case, let's say I actually care a little bit more about health. And so when I do my little mental sums, these have an equivalent value. So they're valued the same. And that means as a decision maker, I'll probably end up choosing poutine about half the time and poke bowl the other half the time because they're equal. It's like a coin toss, which one I choose. But let's say one day I walk into that restaurant and there is the ultimate Canadian bacon poutine burger, which is a thing that actually existed. Let's pretend it's available on a vegetarian patty. Yay. This is the thing that I want more than any other thing. It has by far the highest score, and there is no conceivable universe in which I would not choose the bacon poutine burger over the other two items by a huge margin. So I'm standing in line. I'm really excited about getting this, but when I get to the front, tragedy strikes and the poutine burger is sold out. I can no longer have the burger. It is no longer available for me as a choice in my choice set. Now, if I'm using, again, absolute valuation strategies, we should come back to that coin toss. I should choose the poutine just as likely as I'll choose the salad. But what actually happens for most people is they go, well, and once they get over the grief of not being able to eat the poutine burger, they think to themselves, well, the closest thing to a poutine burger is actually the poutine, so I'm going to choose the poutine. And over time, you'd see on a population level, more people are choosing the poutine over the poke bowl than they would if that sold out item was not in the choice set. Again, this shows us an example of comparative decision-making, because an item that I cannot have, it's not even part of my choice, is changing the way I value the other items in my choice set. So again, this demonstrates comparative rather than absolute decision-making. And again, I think I'm talking mostly about foragers, but again, like to bring up that this can happen. Phantom decoys can occur in other scenarios. So it can be, for example, a nest site that is currently inhabited by somebody else. So I can see the nest site, I can assess it, but I can't have it. It's effectively sold out. You know, it may be a previously profitable patch of food that is now empty. So I remember that there was food there. I used to really like it, but now I can't get any food because all the food is gone. And it can be a mate that's already been taken. Maybe that's the most attractive mate on the planet, but I can't have that mate because it's being guarded by somebody else. So all of these are examples in nature of potential phantom decoys. And so there's plenty of evidence from a whole range of studies in humans that humans fall for decoy effects, both the classic decoy effect and the phantom decoy effect. There's plenty of research, again, primarily because people want to sell us stuff. And so once you start learning about decoy effects, you start to see them in things like the way menus are designed, where maybe there's a really expensive item, doesn't look that good, and you wonder, why is that on the menu? Well, you're not really expected to buy it. It's there because it makes other items look much better in comparison. There's also been interest in decoy effects in public health because as a way of nudging our decisions towards ways that we think are better for people. And there's some really interesting examples of those kinds of nudges using decoys. We've also known, though, since the early 2000s, that decoy effects are not restricted to humans. So this isn't a thing that just happens because humans love to overthink everything. This is something we also see in non-human animals. A lot of the really foundational work in the field is done by Schaefer and Bateson on things like honeybees, gray jays, starlings, and hummingbirds. And there's some really interesting newer examples of phantom decoys in cats, of mate choice decoys in frogs, and other types of decoys in capuchin monkeys as well. So there's a whole range of decoy effects. Now, when I first started getting interested in these decoy effects, one of the things that jumped out at me is that although these effects are widespread through animals, all the creatures that are pictured here, they all have brains. And now that might seem like a really silly thing to say because of course they have brains. Can you even make a decision without a brain? But I think it's an important point because when we take a step back, the vast majority of life forms on our planet are brainless. It's really hard not to make a politician joke here, but I'm not going to. I go past and say most organisms on the planet are brainless, and that includes really big and ecologically important groups like the fungi, the plants, the protists. And while these organisms lack a brain, they still have to make decisions about, which resources to eat, where to move, where to go. But they have to make those decisions in the absence of a brain. And so the organism that I was working with at the time, and I still work with, is something called an acellular slime mold. This particular species is Physarum polycephalum. Slime molds are basically gigantic amoebas. They're in the kingdom of Protista, so they're single-celled. And all the goo you see in this picture, all of that is technically a single-celled organism. It has millions of nuclei, but they're all bounded by the same membrane, so technically one enormous cell. These can get to be up to a meter in width. They're huge as far as single-celled organisms go. In nature, they stream across the forest floor, engulfing anything they can get their little pseudopods on and digesting it. Because they're multinucleate, you can divide them into lots of different pieces, and each piece will become a fully independent individual within minutes of being severed from the main cell. If you stick those back together again, they quite happily join up and become one individual again. So for all intents and purposes, this is the blob from the movies. It's indescribable, indestructible, and apparently nothing can stop it. So we were doing work on slime mold decision-making, which sounds like a strange thing to be studying, but there was previous evidence that slime molds could do all sorts of crazy things like solving mazes. And so to find out what slime molds, whether slime molds have comparative or absolute decision-making, we exploited two features of slime mold behavior. The first is that slime molds love oatmeal. No idea why. They don't eat oats in their natural environment, but for whatever reason, they love oats. And we had previously worked out that they will choose a higher concentration oat food source over a lower concentration oat food source, pretty reliably. The other thing is that slime molds do not like light. In the presence of light, they try to get away as fast as they can. And so we had previously found that if you give slime molds a choice between an item, a high quality item that's in the light, so risky, versus a lower concentration food disk in the dark, the slime molds will make a trade-off such that they'll only choose the illuminated risky food item if it's around 5 times better in quality than the item in the dark, or in the safe item. So they're able to assess both light and food quality and make trade-offs between those two factors. If you're wondering what a slime mold looks like when it's making a decision, this is from a slightly different experiment, but it illustrates it really nicely. That yellow blob is a recently severed slime mold, Plasmodium in the middle. The circular disc on the top is an oatmeal food source, and the oatmeal food source on the top is the highest concentration. The two on the sides are lower concentration. And so once you sever the slime mold, if you give it, about a couple hours, what you'll start to see is that it spreads pseudopods onto each of its possible food items. So it's essentially sampling to see what's there. This isn't growth, so this happens within hours. And so what the slime mold, it's not really growing, it's redistributing its biomass from one place to another. Over time, you can start to see that already the slime mold is redirecting most of its search to the food item at the top, which is the higher concentration one. And if you give it a few hours, it eventually retracts from the lower quality food source and puts all of its effort onto the high quality food source. And so at this point, we'd say the slime mold has made a decision and it's selected that high concentration food disk, as you would expect, because that's, in this case, all else is equal. It should choose the better food quality. So to find out whether slime molds were using absolute decision making, we set up binary choice trials where the slime mold had a choice between a 3% food disk in the dark and a 5% food disk that was exposed to light. And we knew, again, from pilot experiments that those two things are roughly equally preferred. So about half the Plasmodium slime molds will choose A, the other half will roughly choose B. We then compare the decisions the slime mold makes in that trial against a 3-choice trial where we've got, again, A and B, but now we've added the decoy. In this case, the decoy is a 1% food disk in the dark, and we knew that that one was the least preferred. So if they had a choice between the decoy and A, they'll choose A. Decoy versus B, they'll always choose B. This is the least preferred item. And so again, under absolute decision-making, we would expect that the slime mold should just ignore the decoy and still choose A and B about 50% of the time, even in the presence of the decoy, because the decoy is irrelevant. It doesn't really like the decoy. And so to get quickly to some results, these are the proportion of slime molds that chose the target, so A versus the competitor B, and it's roughly 50-50. It's not perfect, but that's not surprising. What is surprising is that when we introduce the decoy, suddenly preference for one of those food items shoots up while preference for the other one drops. And that's despite the fact that very few, I think like 2 slime molds in these trials out of the 83 we tested, only 2 ever chose the decoy. They pretty much ignore it, yet its presence seems to shift their preferences for the other 2 in more or less the same direction as we would expect for humans and other animals. And so this was, I thought, a really interesting result. I was a little disappointed because, full disclosure, I really wanted to have a paper called Slime Molds Are More Rational Than Humans. Didn't happen because it turns out slime molds are just as irrational as humans. They make the same sort of cognitive decisions as we do. And so they're using comparative decision making. And so I think we already knew that lots of animals are subject to decoy effects, but this goes a step further and tells us that decoy effects are actually widespread across kingdoms. So now we have something that doesn't even have a brain is subject to these same types of effects. I think that alone makes decoy effects super interesting. And I would love to see people do experiments to see whether, say, fungi or plants are also subject to these kinds of effects. However, it must be said that those experiments that we've done with slime molds, they're done in a petri dish with items that are carefully selected to elicit these types of effects. And it's not really clear how relevant these things are in nature, or even whether having multiple food sources at the same time is something that slime molds have ever had to deal with in nature. And so to further investigate decoy effects, we decided to look at a system where decoy effects abound, and that's flower visiting insects, or bees in particular. Bees are often foraging on environments where there are multiple different flowers to choose from. The flowers themselves are massively multi-attribute. They vary in nectar concentration, how much pollen they have, and a whole array of other factors. Some of them are rewarding, some are not. And so both phantom decoys and sort of the classical decoys should abound for bees. So it's a really wonderful kind of natural model system to explore decoy effects. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Caitlyin, who's going to tell you more about her research on decoy effects in bees.
I'm essentially going to be stepping back to the animal side of things and talking about a focus of specifically bees, because like Tanya said, there is a huge amount of ecological relevance in considering why phantom decoys might exist in the systems of bees, especially just because of both the combination of bees need to eat nectar and flowers need pollination. So there's a huge benefit for both of these systems being involved and actually causing phantom decoys to occur. So my name's not as rare as Tanya's, so I've got my social media here, but we can always try and chat later if you want to as well. So all of my work was done across Australia and Canada. So I first want to acknowledge the traditional owners where I speak today, and also conducted the experiments in Australia, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I also want to acknowledge that this work was also completed in the territories of the Haudenosaunee people in Hamilton, Ontario. So back on the sort of phantom decoy food side of things, just a quick reminder, when we talk about phantom decoys, we are discussing things like comparing two potentially similar options of food. So, for example, we've got the poutine and the salad. One tastes really good, being the poutine, and one is super healthy, being the salad. And so, generally speaking, I would, in theory, probably pick one or the other at any given time at a flip of a coin. But if given the option of a poutine burger, I'm also going with that one. But this is where phantom decoys come in and become really interesting, because if you remove this particular option from the choice set, then that's when we can start to sort of control what animals, or people in this case, are actually going to pick. So in this case, because the poutine burger is similar to the poutine, we're more likely to pick the poutine. So what does this actually have to do with bees? Now, empty flowers are a really, really good example of a phantom decoy that could exist in nature and be really relevant to both the bees and the flowers, because nectar is important from both perspectives. The bee, they collect nectar, and in the case of social bees, they're collecting nectar for an entire colony. So it's really important that they're supporting a huge network of bees within a colony as well. But the nectar is also really important from plants' perspective. So plants have co-evolved with a range of different pollinators, so bees, for example. And the nectar acts as a reward for bees foraging or other floral visitors foraging, and allowing pollination to occur by moving pollen between the flowers. But one of the things that's really interesting in these systems is that there's always a ton of different flowers in the environment, and bees have to pick which one is the best one to pick. And this could come from a range of things, whether it's, say, the distance from the hive, or the quality of the nectar, or even just if there's a risk of predation, they may want to avoid particular flowers. But because there's so many different flowers in a system, there is potential that these neighboring plants are going to influence choice. And this is where I was interested in how we can use these phantom decoys to see how neighboring plants influence choice. So generally speaking, there's two different kinds of neighboring flowers that impact choice. We've got unrewarding and empty flowers, which are a thing that I'll sort of focus mostly on, but also magnet plants. Now, magnet plants are basically these plants that are highly attractive to a pollinator. The floral visitor will come in, visit the plant, and will keep visiting the plant because they really like it. So across the globe, we often consider things like salvia and lavender really good magnet plants because they attract a whole range of different pollinators. And so when these pollinators visit the flowers, they may actually visit flowers that either look similar or just nearby as well, allowing for these spillover pollination benefits to occur. And then there are empty flowers. So a whole range of flowers exist that either don't have nectar or run out of nectar for a range of different reasons. So, for example, if it's really hot, they might have less nectar. If the flower is super popular to a lot of insect visitors, they also might run out of nectar quicker than they should. And even just things like time of day. So a lot of flowers, particularly in Australia where it gets really hot, will only have nectar available in the morning, and they'll stop producing it just because it's too much energy to do that. There's also plenty of examples of flowers that never actually contain nectar. And this is where an interesting question comes in. If they don't offer a reward for, say, the floral visitors, how are they going to effectively get pollinated if they are relying on floral visitors for pollination? So a really cool example of this is the orchids. Many orchids either have no nectar at all or such small amounts of nectar that it offers really no reward to the bee or the fly or whatever foraging on it. And so they actually gain their pollination benefits simply by looking like another flower that has nectar. So a bee will visit the flower that has nectar and then get confused between these empty orchids that don't contain nectar and still visit them, and then they will eventually get pollinated. So this is a really simple way of how a phantom decoy could influence a choice, in the sense that if you've got this flower that's really, really rewarding and they're jumping around between other flowers, they may visit, say, a purple flower just because the highly rewarding flower is also purple. So this can be really important for working out how we can use phantom decoys for pollination purposes too. Another really cool example is a plant like lantana, which is pretty well known as a super weedy plant in Australia, but it has a really interesting way of gaining pollination benefits at the most effective time. So it starts off with the sort of yellow flowers and they slowly turn red. And the more red the flower is, the less nectar it has. But this is also the older the flower and the less receptive to pollination it is. So it's really beneficial for the flower to actually change color, because it means the bees will start associating only the yellow plants with nectar production, and they will be the most likely to be visited and the most likely to be pollinated. And this happens across a range of different other flowers. Now, this other flower that I've got here on the right-hand side, they also change color as they reduce their capacity to hold nectar. And the thing that's really interesting about this is, from a bee's perspective, they start to look more green, so more like the leaves of the flower, and then they become sort of unrecognizable to the bee as they get older and less receptive to pollination. So this is a really interesting part of how flowers work and effectively attract pollinators. So we do know that empty flowers can impact visitation. Obviously, if there's less flowers with nectar, it's less likely that bees are going to forage on them. But we also know that there is a decreased number in times that bees feed on flowers in a patch if there's empty flowers. So they're going to jump around less, which can have some benefits because it can stop plants from being sort of self-pollinated. But it can also be a problem if there's lots of different flowers in a patch, and it can also stop the variation in genetics being passed through the pollen. But we also don't fully understand how empty flowers do impact the neighbours of the neighbouring plants. So if a flower disappears and the honeybees or the bumblebees have to pick another flower, they are more likely to pick something that's similar in colour. But that's all we really know about the impacts of empty flowers. So this is where it comes into trying to see if we can use phantom decoys on bees in a sort of flower perspective. So the way that this works is, let's say that the bee normally prefers this blue flower. It's really high in nectar, or for whatever reason, it's a really good flower. But then this absolutely amazing orange flower comes along. It's got really great nectar. It's super close to the hive. It's just a fantastic flower. But because of the popularity of this flower, it eventually loses all of its nectar. And so the bees that are foraging on it have to pick something else. They're now associating with this orange flower with the best reward. So the bees start picking the more similarly coloured red flower. And this is sort of just an example of how this is likely to work in the system of bees. So one thing that we do know is that Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee, is actually susceptible to phantom decoys. We know that if you get bees to forage on flowers that are really highly rewarding in both nectar and they're also warm flowers, removing the best flower in that choice set will result in the bees actually picking a flower that's predictable and more similar to the unavailable flower. So we know this is important, at least in this one species. So I was interested in knowing if we can use this in further species for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it is really interesting just in general to know how bees pick flowers in a huge amount of flowers, because we can sort of use this in a pollination sense to work out how we can effectively get bees to pollinate the plants we want them to pollinate. But it is also really important from the perspective of just trying to work out if particular flowers are going to impact pollination in general, which could be important for conservation purposes as well. So I was working on a couple of different species. I'll only talk about the bumblebees and the honeybees today, but what we'll do is we'll start with the honeybee experiment. And what we're interested in knowing is if bumblebees shifted their foraging preferences in the presence of an empty flower, or what is basically a phantom decoy. So bombers impatiens are a super popular bumblebee in North America for studying behavior because they're quite easy to train to get to do a range of different things. They can learn floral attributes really easily, so you can get them to pick flowers based on color or scent and shape and things like that. And they have really obvious preferences that we're already sort of aware of. So we can mess with the floral attributes in a really controlled manner to allow us to run experiments really easily too. We also know that they're impacted by nearby flowers in the sense that they often pick more similar colors. They're also social. So this is a really good example of me had some nectar on my hands while I was running some of these experiments, and a couple of bees landed on my hands, and they all sort of started to follow each other until I had quite a few bees on my hands. But this is really important from a social context and an ecological context, because if they are already doing some kind of social foraging, we need to incorporate that into their decision making to really understand how ecologically relevant these decoys are. So what we did was we checked if a high quality flower is now unavailable, do bees change their preferences between the available flowers, but also are their decisions actually impacted by social behavior? All of this work was actually done in McMaster University. I also did a whole stack of pilot experiments in Tanya's parents' backyard. So that was a pretty fun way to run an experiment and also get to know Tanya and her family. So that was fantastic. It involved about 246 bees from 3 different colonies. So you can actually purchase these colonies pretty readily to run experiments. And what we do is we sort of have 2 kind of even flowers. One that has 40% sugar content, and then cotton ball on top, and the cotton ball is on the top of the flower simply to make the nectar really accessible. And then we have a 45%, so higher nectar concentration with no cotton ball. So the nectar is a little bit harder to reach into and get for the bee, so they have to put a little bit more effort in. And so then we have this last really amazing phantom decoy style flower, which has a really high concentration of nectar, but it also has a cotton ball present, so it's really easy to access this nectar. And so they should, in theory, prefer that. So the first thing we have to do is actually work out if they prefer that flower, and then if they're impacted by this flower being no longer available. It's pretty easy to do that. Just remove the nectar in a fake flower, and then see if they change their decision-making based on this empty flower. So what we do is we train bees to just learn to feed on artificial flowers, because all of this was done in a very controlled, artificial way. And once they can do that, what we want to do is work out if the bees can actually prefer the phantom decoy flower so that we know what's going on. So the way that we do that is we train the bees to the 3 different kinds of flowers we have in the choice set, and then put them all together and see what they prefer. And from this graph, you can see from the orange bar that the bees did prefer the phantom decoy flower while it still had nectar. So that's really good because we can use it as a phantom decoy. Then what we need to do is test the bees. All we do then is we have 2 sets of flowers, one set that has just the 2 sort of even flowers, and then another that has all 3 flowers, except this 3rd set with the phantom decoy actually has no nectar in it. So the bees are aware this is a good flower, but they can't actually access any nectar from it. And then we want to know what their preferences altogether are between these 2 options in just the binary set, and then these 2 options in this ternary set where there's 3 flowers available, but one they can't actually get nectar from. And so what we found from this is that the bees preferred the 40% cotton ball present flower. Now, if we compare this in the binary set, we see virtually the same thing happening, whether there's a decoy present or not. So this is 2 different data sets. It's just a very, very similar looking graph. So what we can see here is that the bees were not impacted by these phantom decoys. And then we had a look at separating the bees out in the data set based on how experienced they were with the experiment. So they had to be bees that made 10 visits to each flower type in the training, and then a further 10 visits in the testing phase. And what we found was of these 246 bees, there were 27 experienced bees left to analyze data on. And we just subsetted them out and had a look at what they found, and found pretty much the exact same thing, with just a bit more variation. So what we can see from that is that there wasn't a huge decoy effect on these experienced bees, but 5 of these individual bees did show some evidence of a decoy effect being present, but it's pretty hard to tell if this is relevant or just a little bit of noise within the data at this stage, so we'd have to be checking way more bees to work out what these effects actually are. What we did find, though, was the less experienced bees were actually more likely to just pick a flower based on how many other bees were present on the flower. So they were essentially just following each other around. So this is kind of like a system where if we have a really good food item with a huge line out the back, people are way more likely to actually go to that shop rather than one without a line, especially if they don't know the area very well. And bees are using this exact same strategy. It's a really safe strategy to guarantee that you'll find decent food. And so this really just shows that social information was really important in this system, and this might actually impact whether or not they are ever going to be particularly susceptible to decoys. So from this, do we know if decoys exist? They could, but it's hard to tell without really getting down to individual behavior, without the presence of this sort of social information. But that is the ecologically relevant information that we probably want to know about. So in a natural foraging context, they may not be super susceptible to them. So what we did was we wanted to try and work out if we can untangle this sort of social information factor by working on a species that's pretty easy to work on individually, that's also in Australia, because I was back in Australia at this point. And so we looked at honeybees. So what we were looking at here was, is honeybee foraging choice impacted by empty flowers? And so this experiment was set up at Sydney Uni, and we used about 6 colonies where we trained 45 individual bees to fly inside this little box here. And we essentially just recorded their foraging choice within this box so that they didn't have any kind of issues with social information within the system, which is a really cool way to do a control experiment. Now, bees are super clever. You can train them really easily to just learn to fly inside the door of this box and land on the best possible day. So they're really cool species to work on when it comes to the training factor too. So it's a really similar experiment to the one we did on the bumblebees, where we're looking at how easy it is to access the flower and also how much nectar is available. So we've got one flower that has super concentrated nectar that's quite hard to access, and sort of the opposite of that, which is a lower quality nectar that's quite easy to access. And then this amazing phantom decoy kind of flower that's both high quality but super easy to access. So it should be the preferred flower. And so we train individuals bees to all of these 3 flowers, and then we want to see what their preferences are in a binary set where we've just got the 2 available flowers, and then an empty flower treatment where they've got a 3rd phantom decoy flower, except there's no nectar available for them to feed on. And then we look at their preferences between these 2 sets of the 2 flowers. And what we found was actually pretty similar to the results that we saw with the bumblebees. So when the empty flower was present, they had really similar preferences. And so this really shows that this decoy effect wasn't particularly strong at all in at least the Western honeybees or the European honeybees. But what we did find was if there was an empty flower present, bees actually jumped between the flowers in the choice set a lot more, which sort of shows that that these phantom decoys could actually impact whether or not bees are likely to pollinate, be able to pollinate effectively if there is a phantom decoy around, because they might jump around and move more pollen around. But it is also kind of interesting from a more human perspective, because we did also learn that if there was a phantom decoy present, we were more likely to actually lose bees from the experiment. They'd go forage somewhere else. And so this is something that's kind of interesting when we consider people. When a phantom decoy is present, there is actually evidence that humans are more likely to see this huge sense of urgency. You have to really quickly make a decision and pick something else, and they will actually more likely buy something from the shops as well as just pick a predictable item in a choice set. Whereas bees don't do this. They go, well, I'm going to go find something else because this best option is no longer there. So they are thinking in a different way. And this can also be important from a pollination perspective, because if there's a really good flower that doesn't have nectar, it may actually result in other flowers not getting visitation as well, which can be pretty important from a pollination perspective. So I'll just jump back over to Tanya to summarize all of our decoy stuff. And yeah.
Great. I'll nod to change slides because I don't have control at the moment. Right. So to kind of sum up this chunk of work, I think one of the big things that our work confirms first of all, is that decoy effects are taxonomically widespread, and that's kind of from the slime mold work. But although we can elicit these types of preference shifts in the lab, as soon as things get even a little bit more complicated, those shifts tend to become rare. And we just don't see the strong preference shifts we were seeing before. And whether that's because of the specific composition of the choice set or because of the complexity of decision-making in a more natural environment, we're not sure. But what I think is really interesting is that we're seeing evidence that decoy effects can cause other behavioral changes. So you switch sides. And so, for example, this is work by Gabrielle Orlando, who's now a postdoc at University of Sydney, and his supervisors Peter Banks and Claire MacArthur. And what Gabrielle did is he put out feeding stations for wild foraging swamp wallabies. So these weren't captive animals; these were just animals hopping around the environment doing swamp wallaby things. And for a phantom decoy, he had a food item that was preferred, but which was in a container so that the wallabies couldn't get at it. They could smell it and they knew what it was, but they couldn't get at it. And what he found similar to what we've seen in bees is that the preference shifts were very mild. They were hard to see. I think there was only a couple of cases where an animal actually switched its preferences. But what happened instead was that the animals were spending a lot more time assessing the other options. Next slide. And so what we think we've conceptualized this is thinking about decision-making as having two stages, really. The first stage when you're gathering information, and the second stage where you're actually making a decision. And most research on decoy effects has been on that choice side after the information has been collected. And what we're suggesting here is that we should also look at what's happening on the information gathering stage, because decoy effects seem to be able to have an impact on that step of behavior as well. Next slide. Yep. And so I think from an ecological perspective, there's lots of outstanding questions about when decoys occur in nature, how they affect both the decision that gets made, but also the information gathering step. But even if you don't study decoys and have no interest in studying decoys, I think it's really important to remember that decoy effects can happen in any choice set. And so when we're designing choice sets for experiments in the lab, or when we're looking at choice in the field, it's important to kind of consider that decoy effects can happen and that most animals are in fact making comparative decisions. And so the composition of that choice set can change the things that happen. And so that's it for us. I think we're happy to take questions if anybody has them. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Turn my mic on. Thank you for the great talk. I loved the call to the Canadian poutine, and want to mention we also do sometimes put maple syrup on it too to go really well with that bacon. So we do have a few questions. For people viewing, feel free to ask in the chat, but Ebby and I actually did have a few questions. So wanted to ask about the slime molds to start. One of my questions was, I noticed that they are sometimes very brightly colored. So do they, they almost look like they photosynthesize, but if they prefer dark, I guess it wouldn't make sense that they photosynthesize. So do you know why they're usually kind of colored in that way?
No, I don't. And they vary a lot in color. So Physarum polycephalum, the species we work with the most, is that vibrant, bright yellow. But most of the other species that we find in the wild are more like a cream colored or sort of a brown, much less vibrant color. I know there's at least one species that's bright red, which is pretty impressive. But no, we don't really know why some produce pigments and some don't. Anecdotally in the lab, some of our browner specimens have changed color over time, sort of getting darker or lighter. But we don't know what causes that, and we don't know anything about the pigment production at all. I think slime molds are kind of one of the most interesting but least studied organisms. They are super easy to work with. Strongly recommend anybody is interested. You can order them online in many countries. And we know so little about the other behavior and what they're doing that they're absolutely fascinating. No, as far as we're aware, none of them photosynthesize.
There you go. Ebby also had a question about slime molds. So just sort of a comparative question. Can we compare the decision-making process between slime molds in other animals? So do they take longer to respond, or have more sampling events or false starts?
That's a tricky one. So as far as sampling behavior, and first of all, time, they move real slow. So they're moving about 5 centimeters per hour at like top speed. So yes, they make decisions very, very slowly. As far as assessment time, we've done a little bit of research on speed accuracy trade-offs in slime molds. And in some cases, we found that if they have to make a quick decision, they tend to make more errors. But then in other experiments, we've actually found the opposite, that they were making quick decisions really fast. So it's a little bit inconsistent as how the decision speed relates to decision quality. As far as comparing their decision process to other organisms, and again, we don't have any hard data, but we know that when slime molds are making a decision, inside of that goo, there's regions of the slime mold that are pulsing, and that pulsing drives the flow of cytoplasm through the organism. So if you get more pulsing, you get more flow. We also know that they'll pulse faster if they're on something they like. So if they're on a high concentration food source, the oscillators, the pulsing regions in that area will pulse faster, which causes more goo, which causes them to move in that area. And also, if one region is pulsing quickly, it'll entrain the regions around it, so they'll speed up as well. And so you get this sort of situation where you essentially have competition between all of these different pulsing regions that ultimately drives the direction the slime mold moves and its choice. And from a conceptual level, that's not terribly dissimilar to how neurons in a brain work, with different populations of neurons firing for different alternatives. And it's not all that different from how honeybees in a colony work, or ants laying pheromones. So there do seem to be some kind of higher level similarities in the way systems make decisions, even though they're using sort of totally different hardware to do it. They're running a very similar algorithm, I suspect.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Abby even says that it's cool that we have, that level and good experimental design that we can compare. And it's, in something as simple as a slime mold, it's so interesting.
Yeah, and that's really the hardest part with slime molds, I think, is trying to figure out like what do they perceive and what will work for a slime mold. But once you figure that out, yeah, great organism to work with.
I guess very, very simple to keep. Just give them some oatmeal and they're good to go. And so we did also have some questions about bees. So Caitlyin, you had talked a little bit about how and that was actually one of my first questions once you started talking about it, is there like interspecies differences between their response to the empty flowers and stuff? So there does seem to be sort of some differences, but do we have a reason as to why there might be differences? Does it differ by, solitary versus sort of grouped bees, or is there maybe a difference in what they're perceiving on the flower?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a range of different things. It is worth noting that all of the species that I've tested any kind of empty flower work on are social species, which is super unfortunate and a little bit of a remnant of having a pandemic during a PhD. But I do suspect, just because of the social information playing such a heavy role in the bumblebees, there is a pretty high chance that if you put one of the solitary species in a similar sort of choice scenario, they're probably going to have to be thinking on their own. So they are likely going to be making these sort of quicker decisions rather than these following decisions. So I think that if we were to see decoy effects in social species, it would probably be less likely if they are able to make decisions together. But if you've got the sort of solitary species, I think they would probably be susceptible to these decisions. But there is also so many extra things coming into play. Obviously, I was only really considering nectar quality and things like how accessible the flower is. But the work that Tanya did previously with the Asian honeybees, they were looking at flower temperature and nectar concentration. So it really depends on what combination of attributes as well. And we haven't even started looking at whether or not pollen can have any kind of effects either. So it's a very messy world to try and work out if they work or if they work consistently as well.
I guess it would also be interesting to, because I had just kind of thought of it, because I thought of the picture that you had with all the bees on your hand. I guess the number, like the presence of how many other bees are present, maybe could also affect the decoy effect. Maybe they get more desperate when there's more bees around. so they're more likely to go to the decoys, but that might also differ depending on whether they are social or solitary, because maybe the solitary ones don't really mind, who else is around, whereas the social ones are like, oh no, we need to get all the food.
Yeah. It is sort of interesting as well, because even with the sort of scent marks that bees lay, they can be kind of context dependent, whether or not you should be following or not following other bees. But then there's also some work that shows that different species will sort of use the pheromones of other species of bees to pick flowers. And so some of this social information, who knows if it's going to impact the solitary species or not. They might also sort of take advantage of some of the pheromones as well. So it's a very interesting world to try and untangle.
And so another question was, when we were, I was just thinking about one of the, so similar to how, like, monarchs are poisonous, so bears were, animals learn to avoid them, or we learn to avoid, those poisonous snakes just because of their colors. And I think you did touch upon this a little bit in the talk. Wouldn't bees just learn eventually to avoid the flowers with the markers for empty flowers? Like, I think they go off a little bit more than color, right? Sometimes there's like those UV signals and things like that. So wouldn't they just over time learn to just be like, oh, I know that's an empty flower?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
And sorry,
go on.
There is definitely the kind of situation where they are likely to eventually learn to avoid certain species. But there is also the possibility that if a flower is really, really good, it might just be worth occasionally taking the risk and coming back to it, especially in these cases of the phantom decoys where they are obviously a really good choice. So it's an interesting one because they are really, really capable of learning, but sometimes that doesn't matter. If it's a really good thing to visit, may as well visit it again later. So yeah.
Very true. Yeah, sometimes we'll take those long drives to try and get that
really
good burger, really good something, even though it might be out of stock.
In nature, I think flowers can also be empty and then not empty. So there's some that fill up at certain times of the day and not others, and they can also be empty just because another bee has drank all the nectar. So like Caitlyin said, from the point of view of a forager, if that plant was really good before, even if you hit one empty, it might be worth going and trying again, because maybe it's just that one flower. Maybe the others have refilled.
Interesting. And so we are sort of wrapping up the time, but we do have one final question. Ebby was wondering, are there any studies that looked at whether decoy effects can be reversed by using some other stimuli in any species?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, generally, we typically are only looking at a couple of decisions down the track. And so we don't really expect it to be a permanent thing, like they've shifted to this flower and they'll never shift back. So yeah, I'm not sure. Not sure about the answer to that. I think decoy effects in general are transient things. Like, they're not expected to be permanent at all. Animals learn pretty quickly and they change their behavior.
So that looks like it's it for any of the questions in the chat. If anyone does have any others, feel free to post them, and we can always send them to Caitlyin and Tanya, and we can post the response back. So thank you again, Caitlyin and Tanya, for being our final speakers of 2023. The talk was great. I was so entertained by all the pictures and the jokes, and I was like sitting here laughing at all the funny humor. So just a quick reminder for our speakers for our viewers, that we do still have our conference coming up. So even though this is the end of the seminar series for 2023, we do have our annual online conference coming up on November 16th and 17th. Abstract registration is closed, but you can still register, which is completely free up until just before the day before the conference. So thank you again to our speakers and to everyone who viewed, and we hope to see you again in our seminar series next year. Thank you.